Thanks. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for taking the time. What I want to do today is just share a little bit of some of the work that I've been developing over the last couple of years. It's kind of tied to the documentary that's going to be screening a little bit later. The documentary actually came from this work. It's based on, I was very fortunate to get a 2010-11 Ford postdoc. It gave me a year off from teaching to go out and do a proposed study. So this was actually the study that I proposed to do. And so I used the CRT and LatCrit framework, kind of built on some of the initial work that I had done. My dissertation was on trying to study the Texas school finance system back in the early 2000s to see what was happening with predominantly Latino school districts around the border. So I used that method to apply to an understanding of how superintendents were engaged in the political process around the school finance system, but also kind of delved into the more specifics of the law. So this work kind of has evolved from that initial work. So I'd be happy to entertain any questions you have. I know that you have read a couple of those pieces or one of the pieces as we talk about this. In 1956, October 1956, which we're coming up on the 60th anniversary of it, there was a group of kids in a small South Texas town that had been integrated. 2 years after Brown, there was what they called a Mexican school, even though nobody in there was Mexican, they're all Mexican Americans. The Mexican school was integrated into the regular school because of the Brown versus Board of Education court case. Soon after that happened, they were putting, the school district decided to put Mexican American kids into 3 levels of first grade. They didn't have kindergarten at the time, so they started a beginner class, then a low first grade, then a high first grade. And it was a systematic way of segregating within the school. And very deliberate kind of policy that was put into place by the school board and then implemented by the superintendent and the principal. In 1955, some parents got together and called a civil rights organization that had been formed in the late 1940s to complain. Fast forward a little bit, hired some lawyers, parents continued to push the system, push the issue, and soon came about the Hernandez versus Driscoll court case of 1956-57. So that's what this project is about. I learned about this case, didn't learn about it in school, didn't learn about it through my undergraduate, master's, or even my doctoral program. I found out about it when my mother got sick in 2002. I graduated in 2004, so it was right in the middle of my doctoral program. I was working for the Texas Education Agency in school finance, so I already kind of knew what my project was going to be about. I just didn't have a theoretical framework, a theoretical grounding. I was kind of struggling with that. When my mother got sick and passed away in January of 2002 of cancer, really struggled with whether or not I wanted to even continue with the program. As some of you might, you always have these trials and tribulations during your program. Most of us are working, especially in leadership, through our programs. About a month after we buried her, I found out about this case. I was watching a documentary, and in the documentary, they talked about the Hernandez versus Driscoll case. And that immediately raised all these red flags for me. I was like, what? Driscoll's a small little town outside of Corpus Christi. I mean, if you're not from South Texas, you really would never have heard about Driscoll. And Corpus Christi is where Selena is from. Today's actually her anniversary of her death in 1994. She was my age. That's what the connection there with Selena. So I found out about the case watching this documentary, and I immediately had a flashback to when my mother told me one time when I was about 11 or 12 years old that she was part of a court case as a kid. And I immediately said that must have been the case that she was involved with. Because she told me that one time that she was part of a case, she went to federal court, she testified, and that was the only thing she ever told me. So I immediately made the connection. I was thinking about my mother, I was watching the documentary, we had just buried her, and I said that must have been the case that she was involved with. So that's her the year after she graduated, or after she testified in this case. She was almost 10 years old, in the 2nd grade, and my grandparents were one of the 5 families that sued the district because they were segregating kids based on their Spanish last name. Okay, and I never knew that growing up. So this project was my attempt to apply a critical race theory, LatCrit theory framework to understanding what the case was about, using a methodology that would allow me to push back on policies that continue today, and implement methods that would allow me to be more community-based and figure out ways to understand that policy in current day terms. So that's what this project's about. So the documentary is related, but this is what actually started the documentary process for me. So I'm going to share that with you. So this is Dr. Hector P. Garcia, the founder and president of the American GA Forum. He was a World War II veteran surgeon. This is his initial letter to the state superintendent of schools, complaining about this because parents had already approached him that this was happening. 1955. It's part of his archives. And the case were the facts were that Lina Perez, who did not speak any Spanish, was not allowed to be placed in a white classroom. So her dad was a veteran, and she had moved into town, and the district said, well, all these kids, none of them know how to speak English, so we're going to put them into 3 levels of first grade. That was the rationale. So she moved into town, didn't speak any Spanish. Her parents complained, and that's where it started. The district was systematically retaining Mexican-American children to, I mentioned, beginner, low, and high first grades. This part of the district's rationale was students of Latin extraction don't speak English. And then Alberta Hernandez was the mother that contacted Dr. Garcia, literally picked up the phone. She's in my documentary, she's still alive. She picked up the phone and called Dr. Garcia. He answered the phone in his doctor's office, medical doctor, and the ball started to roll on the court action. What's unique about it is students were placed on the stand to prove that they could speak English. That was the whole district's rationale. The only reason we're doing that is because they don't know how to speak English. So my mother, which I never knew until later, was the first kid out of 8 to testify in federal court with her teachers sitting in the front row and the principal there. So those are the facts of the case. For me, the underlying questions that informed my work was how can Hernandez be utilized to reclaim and retell Chicano histories? How can Hernandez help in reframing educational policy research? And what does Hernandez mean for Chicano education today? When I started the Ford, I was angry and upset that I never knew that, but I'm also a policy guy, and I went through policy school, and oftentimes historical context, and centering issues related to race are not part of major policy frameworks. So I wanted to also think of ways to incorporate racialized analysis in a policy framework. And so these are the 3 questions that guided the work that I was going to set out to do. As some of you might have read, CRT and LatCrit and that policy research. These are the major tenets that kind of guide the framework. Racism is endemic, pervasive, and historical. Whiteness and white supremacy manifested in policies, discourse, and institutions. What I like a lot about it is that it acknowledges and values and centers the experiences. It acknowledges, values, and centers at the very center the experiences of students of color, people of color, whereas other policy frameworks don't allow you to do that. So one of the primary reasons I use this because that's the starting point. We're going to center those stories. It challenges these ideas of meritocracy, neutrality, and colorblindness that are very much part of our discourse. And it's multidisciplinary, social justice transformative projects. Those are the things. I didn't take a CRT class, and they didn't have one at UT Austin, but my chair and advisor, Dr. J.D. Scribner, not J.P. Scribner, J.D. Scribner, one of the scholars that I read a couple things, and he's like, go with it. He was my chair. He could have very easily said, you know what, you're not doing that. That's not what I do. This is what your study's going to be about. But when I started reading this stuff, Dr. Larry Parker, Gloria Latson Billings, Danny Solórzano, Dolores Delgado Bernal, William Tate, those are the ed research people that were doing it. He's like, well, actually, I hired Larry Parker at Temple when I was a dean there. So he actually put me in connection with Larry Parker. Larry Parker got on my committee because of that. And I always credit Dr. J with that, because if it wasn't for him saying, go with it, run with it, see what you can do with it. I would have never even pursued this kind of framework, especially at the University of Texas at Austin, where there wasn't a lot of people doing it. So that's kind of the methodological framework that and the concepts and the tools that allow me to then investigate these questions. The other thing for me was very autobiographical. So I look at it more as a counter policy story. Again, it's very much historically situated. It centers the experiences not only of myself, but my own family history, which I never really considered in doing projects. And here's what I was saying earlier. It challenges traditional educational policy frameworks. I love these guys and women, but traditional frameworks decontextualize, they dehistoricize, they de-race, and what I would argue is they dehumanize. I mean, if you look at policy work, it's very much, we don't often consider the lives and the stories and the history and the experiences of like kids whenever we implement these policies at very district, state, or federal levels. And so part of what I'm trying to do with my framework is like put the human experience, put the human back in the education. It sounds kind of funny, but why are we having to put humans back into it? Oftentimes with like accountability policy or even school finance policy, you take the human experience out of it. So that's what I think traditional frameworks do, and that's what I think CRT and LatCrit allow me to put back at the center. The last thing on my methodological framework is obviously insider outsider. I graduated in '89 from this. I grew up like right down the street from Driscoll, and that's the other thing that really bothers me is like Driscoll, the small little town, one stoplight. I grew up in a town that's a little bit bigger. It's like 20,000. It's a small farming community also. It was right down the street from where I grew up, but I never knew that all this like history, like civil rights history, was not only my own family, but was like literally right down the road. So I moved away and I moved to San Antonio as an undergrad. My dad still lives there, but I'm an insider, but I'm an outsider. So I had going back and collecting those stories into a small community. The minute you show up with a rental car, everybody knows you're not from there. So even though I had an insider and people knew my family and knew my mother really well, and in fact, doing this project, like I'm not actually a third generation Tejano, but I'm a fourth generation because I found out more family history that makes me even more of an insider. I still had to figure out how to balance that researcher, insider, outsider perspective. My methods and data sources. So I did a little bit more than 30 oral history interviews with people that grew up before the court case, during the court case, and after the court case. I found 7 of the 8 original student witnesses, my mother being the only one that I didn't get a chance to interview. There was 2 parents that testified, one of them still alive, and I interviewed her. Most of them still reside in Driscoll or in South Texas. A few of them were done over the phone. A few of the interviews were done over the phone because one lives in Seattle, the other one's in New Mexico, and I couldn't get there. Most of them one-on-one, but I had a couple platicas, which is more of an informal kind of sit down, in groups and have more of an informal conversation about that time period rather than a straight, interview kind of protocol. And the biggest thing for me is this guy, my father. My dad worked and retired right after my mother passed away. He was married to her for 33 years, and he was a blue-collar guy. I'm first-generation college student, so he never quite understood what I did as an academic anyway. So this was my opportunity to work with him. He actually was my research assistant. Like I would fly down from Salt Lake on a Thursday, drive down there, and I would already have a list of people that I needed to find, and he would go find them for me. And he made first contact for me. He explained for people, my son's coming into town, this is the project. I would obviously go in and explain, would you be a participant? I had IRB approval, all that. But the fact that he had legitimacy, much more legitimacy than I did, right off the bat, opened a lot of doors for me and actually found people that I couldn't find. He was retired, and as he talks about it, he used to be a bill collector back in the day. He worked for a collection agency. So he said that skill really helped him. And even though it was a small town, if you don't want to be found, you won't be found. And so the 7 out of the 8, 2 of them I could not. I used every method that I knew. He was able to find for me in this town. So part of what I never thought about was I've done several interviews with my dad about that process. So I'm going to hopefully do some qualitative methods writing on that working with your dad, working how that works, and the fact that the best part I think was doing the interviews and then going. He would sit in them. You'll hear some of the clips. You'll hear him in the background. I had to keep telling him like, don't talk. But actually, him being a part of it actually helped people relax and have more trust with me. But when we left and we debriefed, I would interpret it one way, and he would be like, that's not the way I'm looking at it. He pushed back on a lot of my interpretations of it. So he actually helped me with the analysis a lot more than he even knows about it. He was a migrant farm worker growing up. A lot of these folks are migrant farm workers. I never migrated. I never worked in the. I was very privileged in the fact that by that time my family didn't have to do that. So he really helped me with that analysis part. So that's kind of my methods on this end. A lot of documents and photos, and so a lot of my presentations I use a lot of photos. They're personal photos that people shared with me. I've also did archival work. So all the Hernandez documents, the local school board minutes, the Texas State School Board minutes, local newspapers, the Dr. Hector P. Garcia papers at Texas A&M Corpus Christi. Actually, they're about to digitize all those. It's pretty cool because he started this work right after the World War II. He died. President Reagan gave him the highest honor, the Medal of Freedom, right before he died in the late 80s. So he has a long span of like activism, locally, state, and national. All the papers are going to be online now. Dr. George Sanchez papers. Dr. George Sanchez was, I think, the first or very few Latino scholars at UT Austin at the time, and he used to be an expert witness in all this, in all these cases, and he actually was in this case. So his papers are at UT Austin, and actually the College of Ed building is now named after him, which is shocking to me that my mother was around all these experts too that like have been written about, and I never knew that. A lot of family photos and school yearbooks that I was able to find. And then last thing, again, because it's interdisciplinary, I've looked at a lot of Mexican American Chicano studies literature to help me kind of methodologically fill that part of it out. So some of my initial sense making, I'm writing the book right now. So I was supposed to have the book done before the documentary, but the documentary took off. And I'll talk about that tonight, but I met a guy in Salt Lake City who's a filmmaker. Everything just happened in a way that I was able to get that project going while I was writing. I took 2 administrative positions, and some of us know when you do administration, it's really hard to keep writing. So I have 2 of the chapters written. It's supposed to be 6 chapters, and so I'm trying to get it done late this year, early next year, because it's the 60th anniversary of the case. So this is some of my sense making right now. Chicano life in the 1950s, South Texas, segregation, floods, cotton, Driscoll schools, sites of punishment and ridicule, Hernandez case, Chicano resistance, resilience, and activism, and the untold stories. Remembrance hurts, but it also heals. So when you're writing your papers, this is like the themes. These are the themes that emerge from all the oral histories. These are the themes that emerge from the photos, from the archives that I've been able to find. And right now, since there's so much, these are the 4 kind of ways that I'm trying to organize and tell this part of the story. So let me share a little bit of that. The context was it was a small town, 1950s, this population was very much split white, Mexican American, but run by white men, or whether they were the school board, whether it was the county, the landowners were all white males. It was very much divided by geography and employment and education. It literally had a railroad running right through the middle of it. And on this side of town where the Mexican, which people still say the Mexicans lived over here. Even I grew up that way, and I'm not Mexican. I'm Mexican American. And on this side of town is where the whites lived. Cotton was very, very part of the oral histories. Even today, if you drive down there, the whole town is surrounded, and there's some pictures. It's just surrounded by cotton fields, and it's very much a part of the history and the legacy of this community. And then, as I mentioned, most of the families, very few independently, were independent of the farm working stream. So like my mother's family would migrate, and you hear stories of people migrating up to the Lubbock area, Panhandle. There was that stream of the cotton farm picking that happened. And in fact, one of the towns, Robstown, which is a little bit north of there, is the high school. It's the Robstown Cotton Pickers. It's such a big part of the fabric of that community. So that's what Driscoll contextually is about. So let me try to play some of this. I'll translate afterwards. I haven't been able to translate. One thing I started experimenting with that actually kind of led to my documentary is I started experimenting with iMovie. Because I had so many photos and I had audio, digital audio. And rather than, like I've gone to conferences and I've done it, where it's just like, here's a quote. And then you just read the quote, like I did it this morning. Just read the quote. I wanted to try to see what would it look like to present, like in 2 or 3 minute clips, mini movies basically, that let the data speak for itself, and then weave in photos that I was able to collect at libraries, personal photos, yearbooks, so that you get a sense of the themes a little bit more than me just reading a quote. So, but some of it's like Spanglish and Spanish, and so I'll translate afterwards. Let me see, we can figure this out. That should be it, right, Chris?
Yep.
Ranch last time I was here with my dad, and I was all full of cotton and stuff. And I asked my dad, when you could he pick cotton too for many years, and I said, when you see that field, how does it make you feel?
No, I feel honestly, I feel good because I don't have to be on those fields anymore, you know. And I feel, you know, we didn't have a choice. We had to go pick up. You know, I remember one time, you know, my brother asked my dad for a pair of gloves. He said, "You don't big enough to get a pair of gloves." So, you know, my sister was the one that really picked. Oh, my sister would pick more than my dad. She was good. Oh yeah.
Class.
She was the type, you know, that she just never raised her head and just picked all God, didn't they?
When you see the cotton fields, does it make you feel? What does it make you feel like? Do you remember when you were in grocery?
Pues yo digo gracias a Dios que se acabó. Porque los botitos míos no tengo que pescar. Como yo me acuerdo cuando estaba chiquito yo que mi papá, yo me acostaba arriba de las sacas cuando pescaba. Ahí dormía.
He used to lay down on top of the sacks. He's just talking about how thankful to God that he's not having to do that anymore because his kids never had to do that.
Ahí dormía yo.
He would sleep on top of the sacks.
Y después que crecí, pues comencé a pescar también.
¿Cómo qué edad comenzaste? 8 o 9?
Oh, ya para esa edad te traen en la boca.
8 or 9 years old.
Ya podías levantar los capullitos de la mata ya. Y yo me acuerdo que usaban los tenis y no estaban muy buenos que digamos. Tenía que esconder los pies en la sombrita de la...
They used to wear tennies out there, and so it was so hot that he tried to find as much shade under the plants because it was so hot that it would burn his feet. That's what he's talking about.
Sombrita de las matas, porque estaba caliente. Como dice mucha gente ahorita, mate no estaba tan caliente así, no, porque no pescaste, ¿me entiendes? O no tuviste el azarrón, o...
He's saying some people say now it's not as hot as it used to be. He said, and he tells people, well, that's because you weren't outside. That's because you never. He's kind of lecturing me too. He knew that I never picked cotton, and he's kind of relating me to his sons who never had to do it either. So he's like, you guys don't really know what hard work is. You never been outside. It was hot.
Con su trabajo de afuera, miren. Ahora pues es muy diferente, ya no hay nada de eso para los chamacos, como habían, pero no, sí estaba caliente.
Yeah, she code switches too with me. She goes back English, Spanish. It's very, very, very common in South Texas. But she's talking that they started very, very young with her mom and her dad, and that's her family right there. And those were her personal photos. We had a good time. We had to do what we had to do and made the best of it.
And then you put it and let you
So some girls could even do 100 pounds in a sack, put it over their shoulder and take it. So there's lots of stories like that that I wanted to kind of represent there in the, how do I go back to, I'm not a PC guy.
The bottom right, there's just a little bit further left. There's like a that one. Yep. Thank you.
So yeah, there's lots of, in that part of the chapter, I'm trying to contextualize the cotton, the migrating, the amount of work, the education that they got by being in the fields. She was one of the older family kids, siblings. So she talks a lot about her role in that picture of actually she's the one that's notating all the how many pounds, how much of a responsibility that was for a young girl to be able. I mean, the family's livelihood depending on her being accurate and making sure that that was always done right. So there's lots of data about that and how it was the interactions between the white farmers and the family members. Again, contextualizing 1950s South Texas and what that meant for these families. The second big theme for me was this idea of educating Chicanos Texas style. The idea of intimidation and corporal punishment as normal. That was normalized educational practice, a lot of it around Spanish speaking. The discouraging of Chicano school children from the beginning. People sharing the idea that they felt like they were lesser than, especially when they got a little bit older. I mean, my mother was almost 21 when she graduated, and I wish I would have had a chance to talk to her about how she persisted all the way through. The fact that she was able to graduate even after going to 3 years of first grade. I mean, that's again part of our knowledge, part of our history, part of the resistance in our own communities that doesn't get centered. So that's what the project's about. But a lot of this discouraging happened very, very early on. This idea of equating Spanish with retardation and inferiority. I mean, retardation's all over the documents. How people who spoke Spanish were retarded. I mean, that's how blatant it is on the legal documents and on the school documents, on the local school board minute documents. And very much about, and the rationale was if we integrate, we're actually going to hurt the white kids by bringing in these retarded kids. So it was very, very much a systemic way of looking at it. And then the hostility and the hatefulness and the hurtfulness, the people that I talk to are all in their mid to late 60s. And so that feeling is still, and I tell teachers this all the time, like there's such a power of, you have such an opportunity to be a positive influence on kids because these people are grandparents and great grandparents now, and it's still like very vivid to them what they went through. But that's kind of the context that they gave me. Let me share just a short clip on that too.
Mrs. Green, not being really nice.
She was a devil. I had her too. And Mrs. Green spoke more than one ruler of my hand for speaking Spanish. Speaking Spanish, she was the one that would get you on your head. Get you on your head. And she put several rulers on me because even then I guess I was pretty talkative.
Right.
And even then, she was the teacher. Spanish was a bad language. I shouldn't speak Spanish in school. The only thing was, well, I'm got to learn English. The boys would be taken out into the hall, and they had to bend over, and they would count the swats. Boys would get many more swats. I mean, they would get maybe 3 to 5 swats on my hand with a ruler. But the boys would get paddled, and I mean a paddle, and they would make them bend over, and more often than not, a female teacher would get a male teacher to swat the boys.
There was a Mrs. Fritz, cuarto, y tenía un divider que observaba y se oía la música. I love music. I always wanted to be in that class. Why did they get into that room? Because me gustaba la música y me gustaba cantar, me acuerdo, en los programs que tenían ahí en Frisco.
He's talking about they were in the same big room, but they had a divider, and he could hear the kids on the other side like singing. So he always wanted to be in that room, but he could never get in that room.
I was the first one, porque bailábamos I was the first one. Y cuando cantábamos, I was the first one to come out y me decían, louder. Me estaban contando a mí, me decían mi nombre y I would sing loud. Pero me gustaba mucho la voz de abuelo, por lo menos this no, nunca, I never got there. Instead I got the carro que andaba en español ahí en la esquina. Y después la Miss Wilson también lo pegaba con la rula, la mano. Y ella que pegaba con la tabla, we speak Spanish on the school grounds, ahí en la escuela.
So not only in the classroom, but if you're playing at the playground,
Los gringuitos turn you in.
they'll wrap you out.
Little white kids would turn them in for speaking Spanish.
Wrap you out.
Yeah, she would do it.
They believe that. What if they were lying? If they were
We were not allowed to. So sometimes we would go all day without being able to communicate because we didn't know how to speak English.
What if you needed to go to the restroom or something? You just kind of.
Well, I need to tell you because we're on tape. I'm going to tell you something that happened to me, and this was the worst of the worst that ever. And even now, I think about it. I asked the teacher if I could go to the restroom, and she ignored me. She wouldn't let me go, and I pooped my pants. Do y'all remember? I had to walk home, and mother let me stay home that day and the next day because I was so embarrassed to go back. She didn't let me go to the restroom. She ignored me. That for sure, I know.
And that's something you still.
I remember, and I cannot get over it ever. You know.
Embarrassed.
I mean, I put my pants, and having to walk from school to home to take a bath and everything. It wasn't like they sent me to the nurse to clean me up, or I was little, but I remember clear.
That's my aunt talking. My last grandparent died during the middle of this project. My grandmother, my mother's mother, and so I had gone down to. She testified in the court case. There was 3 sisters. My mother and her 2 sisters testified out of the 8 kids. And she was the youngest, and she hadn't told that story. My mother was the oldest of 6 girls and 1 boy. And so all the other siblings were sitting around after we had just blessed the headstone for my grandmother. And she thought her sisters knew that story. Like she was carrying that with her the whole time. So she asked for them to be part of the interview that I was doing. And hadn't shared that. Nobody knew about it. But she was still carrying that around. So there's examples like that throughout the whole process of people's pain and hurt and never having talked about things and the healing process that goes with that. So the last theme that I'll talk about is this idea of Chicana activism, resistance, and leadership. And as somebody that's in a leadership program and teaches, issues related to leadership and policy, what I want to do with this book and this project is not just, there was leaders like Dr. Garcia and James De Anda, who was the lead attorney at the time. He became a federal judge, very well known in Houston. And then obviously Dr. George Sanchez, scholar, expert witness. There's books and research about them. I mean, there's library collections about them. So what I'm doing now is, in finding out that the story is that mostly mothers led this whole court action. They were the spearheads, even though the men came in. And the men's names were actually on the court action. The people who organized it and pushed it were the mothers. And that's leadership and that's resistance that we don't often acknowledge. The Junior GI Forum, which is a group of teenage girls. The American GI Forum was made up of men, veterans. There was a women's auxiliary that was made up of their wives. And then there was a Junior GI Forum made up of young kids. Also helped mothers getting signatures and organizing people. And then lastly is just the children. All the children between ages of 7 and 10, they all took the witness stand. What I'm framing it as leadership and as activism. The fact that they were in that kind of situation, and like I mentioned, they were literally in court for 2 days, and the very next day they went back into the classroom after just having testified against their teachers. So to me, that's activism. To me, that's leadership that doesn't often get acknowledged. And again, CRT gives me the frame to do that. So here's a picture of the 3rd graders the year after it happened, after they were forced to integrate. And so I also have these documents to help me, tell this theme and to flesh out this theme a little bit more. This is my mother's testimony. This is probably the best part of the whole project, because I don't think these documents had ever been touched. I found them in Fort Worth. I took a week and went down to up to Fort Worth when I was still in Austin, and I went and photocopied it. I don't know if you guys have ever seen like Raiders of the Lost Ark, the first one at the very end, the big warehouse. That's what it felt like, because it was a national depository, but you can't go back there. You basically tell them what you want, and somebody goes back to in the stacks or whatever and gets this box out. So the guy comes back with the box, and you can't leave the facility. You have to go into the copier room. So I opened up this box, and it's like all this carbon paper, carbon copies, and it smells old, and nobody's ever touched it. And at that point, I didn't even know my mother was the first to testify. So when I saw the list of witnesses and that she was the actual first one to testify, and then to actually read it was crazy for me, So, but this is the last part of her testimony. The whole first part of it is the judge is actually telling the kids. He didn't do this with the teachers, but with the kids, he said, if you don't tell the truth, I'm going to send you to jail for not telling the truth. So before they even started testifying, when they're taking the oath, he's threatening all the kids that way to tell the truth. And so all the kids testified in English, again, proving that they're bilingual. Okay, but this is how it ended, it's an example of leadership and resistance to me, my mother testifying. Do you think any of the teachers wanted to be mean to you? Was the question from the school district's attorney. And then she didn't answer, which is what kids usually do when they don't want to. They're not going to. Her teachers are in the front row. Do you think the teachers wanted to be mean to you? So the judge warns her. You understand the question he asked you? Do you think any of those teachers wanted to be mean to you? So my mother says, I don't know. And then the district's attorney then says, well, you don't think they wanted to be mean to you, do you? Again, trying to force her to say something. She says no. Then he says, you really like them? And she refuses to answer. The attorney says, that's all. And then the plaintiff's attorney says, I believe that's all. Thank you, Lupe, come on down. And then the judge says, you speak good English now, Lupe. So to me, the fact that she refused to answer it, and the fact that and then other kids resisted that way, that's what happens with my kids. When they don't want to get in trouble, they just don't answer. They resist that way. But oftentimes we don't look at this kind of action as resistance or leadership. And there's other examples that I'm trying to bring out by looking at the court documents and the testimony throughout. Last thing is, so what does this mean for developing a framework, a policy framework, a critical race policy framework, what I'm calling it. So, the first thing that I would say is humanizing policy. We talk about bilingual ed, tracking today, accountability, how we deal with issues related to undocumented students. I think we need to humanize it as much as possible, and linking what happened then, today's racist policies, and then centering the lived experiences, forefronting those experiences, and really acknowledge that this is where we come from. And policies don't just come out of thin air; they come from somewhere. And so I think any kind of policy framework to humanize it and to center these experiences is really, really important. Secondly, is validating these Chicano experiences from yesterday and applying them today. So I think oftentimes policy happens at the state capitol, it happens at the district office, and when teachers get policy or when even principals get policy, we're very passive about it. And so what I did as a way to kind of make it more validating is I went and had a reunion about 3 years ago. I invited all the participants. We went actually to Driscoll, because some people still live around there. We went to the actual library that was still standing. They just knocked down the whole building. I'm glad we did it. And they built a new one. It's the same exact building. And I shared all this research, and we actually had a reception, and we got to do it in the school that they all went to. So I think that's one way of validating experiences, and it makes policy more relevant. And I actually presented it to the 8th grade class of Driscoll, who didn't even know anything about it, who had family members who were part of this. So again, that's a different way of looking at policy and a framework that allows us to make it more real. And the last part of what I'm thinking about right now is, so what does this mean, our kids in CRT, and how would you apply a critical race policy pedagogy? And so for me, my mother's name was Guadalupe, and my oldest daughter is named Hema. At the time that I was doing this initial part of the project, my daughter was the same exact age that my mother was, and so they were, when my kids were around the whole time. Like, I would come back from a trip and we talk about it. She was just about 2 years old when my mother passed away, so I had another daughter after that. So for me, and I grew up with a bunch of guys, so it's kind of weird, or not weird, but I'm learning a lot about myself having girls. So in a good way, but I really wanted them to have a strong sense of who they were. That was really, really important to me. I didn't want my mother's legacy to die. I wanted them to understand that they come from very, very strong people, a very strong person. So so part of this pedagogy to me was a way to share this kind of legacy. And then my kids are growing up very privileged. My wife's a professor too, and they're getting experiences that I never got, she never got, that my mother never got. So how do you keep kids grounded and really rooted in their responsibility to be part of this legacy? And so one thought was for me this is my mother and my daughter at the same age when this happened. They look a lot alike. She reminds me a lot of her. We have the same kind of relationship. It's kind of weird. And so this is Ruby Chacon, local Salt Lake City artist. And I asked Ruby, what would it look like if I shared some of this audio and photos with you? Because I'm kind of thinking of this book. And could you do a portrait for me for my book cover? So I'm doing everything backwards. I have a book cover already. I got to get the book done. I got a documentary. But I had some research money that I wanted to use towards this. And I actually wanted her to work with Hema, because Hema likes art, to listen and then interpret through Hema's eyes what the book cover would look like based on these themes that I'm seeing in this audio. So that's one way to pedagogically to pass down that knowledge so that my daughters and my son have a real strong understanding of where they come from, but it makes critical race theory a little bit more relevant to them, and it worked out pretty well. So this is what they came up with. So this is a pretty big, it's in my living room now, but their interpretation was, these are some of the little kids that testified. This is my mother and this is Hema at the same age. You see the cotton fields up top in the clouds. That's cotton. The floods were another big part of the context. Whenever it would rain, we have big thunderstorms down there. It's on the Gulf Coast, so whenever there's a tropical storm or thunderstorm, because of the railroads, the way it's situated, the Mexican side of town gets flooded all the time. So there's lots of photos of people like playing in the water. These are two kids playing with their dog in the water. It's very commonplace. The railroads, they interpreted the railroads as segregation, and then obviously the cotton pickers. And this is an interesting interpretation. Another theme that I didn't talk about is veterans. That's my second cousin, Leonel, who died at the age of 19 in Korea. One of those kids that was pushed out. He went through the whole segregated process, and he died there. But their interpretation, Ruby and Hema's interpretation of that was that part of the story is only half told. It remains to be told. That's one interpretation, and Hema says that the other interpretation was that Leonel is kind of looking over the girls from a different place. So I think that's another part that's pretty major. Especially in South Texas, where there's so many families that their young men and now women are part of the military services. And it's part of the American GI Forum. One of the reasons the American GI Forum, as a World War II veterans group, really started because of their participation in World War II with our veterans. So that's kind of my interpretation of how critical race theory pedagogically can work with young kids as a way for her to interpret the data that I was able to find. And now I just got to finish the book so I can use it as a book cover. And for me, now that it's in my living room, it's the first thing people see when they walk in my door, and my kids see it all the time. And it's something that we can talk about that I haven't done before as far as my research, but that's kind of what I'm thinking about now with young kids. With that, let me stop there and entertain any questions that you might have. Critique or questions about this or the other work that I know you guys have read the school finance piece too. So the documentary tonight. Oh yeah, go ahead.
So, this isn't so much a question about the specific content, but how to work, how different disciplines can work together on issues like this. And I think what's really interesting about this, to me in particular, is that we're trying to bring the human back into policy. And when we met earlier, I told you I was an educational psychologist. So as a psychologist, one of the things I think about often is how do policies unintendedly affect individual psychology. So you implement such and such policy. Well, how does that affect the student in the classroom? And specifically, I'm interested in motivation and those sorts of things. So I see, alignment between the sort of different things that we think about in different ways, but it's all sort of bringing like, how do these broader structural issues affect individuals or groups of individuals, that sort of thing. So how does one bring those two things together? So how does someone outside of policy work with folks who make policy and do research on policy and sort of bridge those two different areas?
That's a good question. Yeah, my background is at the state level, so I did a lot of policy work with school finance systems, and so I never saw like what the implications of the funding that was getting down to the local level, because I just talked to superintendents and I talked to assistant supes for finance and business people. So the way I kind of look at this is I think there are multiple ways you can look at it. So multiple layers of policy. There's a local level, there's an individual level, and obviously there's state, district, federal that I think we can look at multiple levels and layers of the framework that you can apply. I'm really interested at the individual level much more now, having done a lot of stuff at the state that is still good. It's just not. A lot of people are doing it that way. I would rather have conversations about how federal immigration policy really is impacting a young kid in Salt Lake City that just arrived and is just trying to make sense of the world. Like as a school leader, as somebody who works at a community level, we're not able to provide a space for that young kid to kind of make sense of his own place. Then all the policies that we pass isn't going to really mean a big difference. And so that's kind of how I approach it. The question that you had about psychology and the kind of work that you do, one of the things that I've been struggling with is, well, part of it is I'm right in the middle of this. Part of the reason I've taken so much time to write it is that, I'm such a big part of it. My mother's right in the middle of it. I'm trying to, and the people that went through it are still alive. They're wanting to see a finished product. So I have to be honest about some of the stuff that I've heard, but I also have to take care that they did share very personal stories with me. That's really hard for me. My good friend Dolores Delgado Bernal is really pushing me to do Chicano feminist thinking. That's not my background, but because so many women and little girls were part of this, she's really pushing me to use it. There's a whole bunch of stuff there about healing and the psychological trauma that people went through, and that's one of the reasons my mother never talked to me about it. She wasn't ready, and she was trying to make sense of it for herself. There's a whole bunch of stuff on memory, what people choose to, how they interpret this. There's people who were there. My aunt, one other aunt was there, and she remembers it totally different. Granted, and she's owned up to it, that she was treated differently because she was very, very white complected, very, very pale, whereas some of my other aunts were like my color, who were treated totally different at the same exact time. So she's trying to make sense of that for herself. So so your question about policy, I think that thinking about it at multiple layers, figuring out how policy can be interpreted at an individual level, at a community level is important to me. That's kind of where I want to focus the book too.
One of the things you mentioned earlier on is not only looking at the past, but also the present and the future. And so I'm just curious about, you've looked a lot at the past, but you're in the context now as well. What's it like in this place at this time? And how does this work? How does it inform that, the local context, and where is it now?
This actual?
Sure.
Yeah. part of my documentary, I was able to interview one school board member and the current day superintendent. And the book's going to focus mainly on the historical narrative. Yeah, I get a lot of questions about what's going on there. It's still like 99.9% Mexican American. I haven't really delved that much into their achievement. It's just the same kind of community. It's K through 8, the way it was at that time. They literally just replaced the building. They're still kind of furnishing it right now, but there's still kind of they didn't really want to embrace it. Like I asked the superintendent, like, can I donate a part of the film? Could we put something up? Some community members wanted to put down a marker, some kind of monument, because it's part of Texas history that's not often acknowledged. There's been just a lot of resistance about talking about it, even today. I just think that people aren't comfortable, especially the administration aren't comfortable bringing it up again. But the book and the work that I've been doing thus far, I really haven't delved that much into the current day situation there, even though I've been kind of pushed that way. I might need to think about that. Right now, I'm just trying to, the major themes that I have, I'm trying to make sure that I'm doing them justice and figuring out a way to talk about my methodology in a way that's going to be, robust and rigorous. The other thing that I was going to say when you mentioned I'll think of it in a minute.
Can you talk about, you've had tons of data, and you talk about your core themes or stuff. How did you make your choices about which themes, how those themes emerge, but then also how you make choices what themes to use?
That's what they are right now. Yeah, that's the difficult part is, what's the common thread all the way through? How much of myself is going to be in there? There's nothing on there about my methodological theme. I don't know exactly, does it go in the appendix? Does it go up front? How honest do I heard a lot of stuff about patriarchy, even in my own family. Like people start telling me stuff about the way my grandfather was with my grandmother. A lot of these guys were coming back from World War II with post-traumatic stress. I heard a lot about my grandfather's alcoholism, and he was self-medicating before he wasn't an alcoholic, and when he comes back, he's totally jacked up. How much of that goes in there when we're talking about gender? That's what Chicana feminist is going to have me do, and even in fact, and all these guys were dealing with that. So the themes emerged, I think, just from having conversations like this, going back to what the framework allows me to do, which is centering the most prevalent themes that I heard in doing oral histories. And I went into these oral histories just saying, what do you remember about the case? What was it like to live there? I mean, it was very open-ended. Immediately people went to the farm working, to how tied they were to the cotton industry, cotton fields. They immediately went to the hostility. Like none of them have gone to their high school reunions. Like they refused, like they had such a bad experience, they don't want anything to do with that kind of, so the hostility, the culture that was there was very, very much a part of what they talked about. And so I kind of just took a step back after looking at all the transcriptions, listening to lots of video, looking at photos, trying to group things in a way that would make sense that I could write about. I haven't, not with all the themes, but I haven't gone through the subheadings. I mean, that's the next step for a lot of what I want to do is after the 4 major themes, how do I break that apart and make sure that I'm capturing the spirit of what they said. And it's just a lot of back and forth. You guys use document map? You guys have, I was just talking to my grad students about it on Word. There's a way to kind of categorize things so that the outline is basically on the left-hand side of your document. And so I do a lot of skipping back and forth on my outlining and just trying to figure out a way to kind of tell a narrative. Right now I'm playing with this idea of the King Ranch. You guys heard of King Ranch before? Texas Monthly just did a big spread. It's like the 100 and something anniversary of the main house on the King Ranch, which at the time was, or still is, one of the biggest ranches in the whole world. I was born and raised in Kingsville. King Ranch is like, that's their old land. I went to elementary school at Clayburg Elementary, which is the son-in-law, and I graduated from high school at H.M. King, Henrietta M. King High School. King Ranch is everywhere there. It's very much a part of land, cotton ranching. that narrative, that historical narrative, is physically, symbolically all over the place. But this is not. So part of what I want to do is how do I do a book that is going to put this front and center and allows me to kind of reframe that part of our history that has never been acknowledged. So that's kind of, I keep going back to that purpose. What's the purpose of the book? What's the purpose of the book? What's the purpose of the
I
book?
found the excerpt that you put up there, there's that short piece with the court and your mom. Just the last comment struck me where maybe it was the judge or somebody said,
You speak,
I speak good English now.
which again, personally, like I speak horrible Spanish. I'm not fully bilingual. I didn't grow up fully bilingual. So I always wondered about that. A lot of Texas, a lot of Tejanos that second, third, fourth generation, Angela Valenzuela writes about it in Subtractive Schooling. I don't know if you guys have read that book. Check it out. It's an ethnography of Houston's high school where you have new immigrant Mexican immigrants and you have second, third, fourth generation Mexican Americans, and the language issues that you just assume that I speak. Most people assume that I speak Spanish, but I don't. My Spanish is horrible. I mean, this tells me a lot. But listening to these stories, they were punished for it. My parents made a strategic choice to not do that. But that's what struck to me with reading that testimony is that that's the last thing that the judge tells her.